Our theme today is building resilient, agile and sustainable supply chains for the future of work. And we have a full agenda with user case experiences and also insights from a number of technology and digital experts in this field. There's no doubt that supply chain leaders have been challenged to fundamentally rethink their traditional ways of working as a result of the many disruptions they've faced. Yesterday's logic and legacy processes and tools were so often exposed over the last few years, and it's given rise to a fresh and more data-driven approach, which will be one of our key themes today. Firstly, a bit of a history lesson, the next slide, on how supply chains have been disrupted over the last few years. So just a bit of history lesson here to set the context. We've had the COVID lockdowns in many countries over the last few years, beginning in 2019. Of course, that led to the semiconductor shortages, which immediately impacted manufacturing supply chains. Automobiles were a very noticeable casualty of that. In Australia here, you couldn't buy a used car or a new car for supply chain reasons, and the price of second-hand cars shot up outrageously as a result. Then, of course, we had the Ukrainian war and its impact on energy prices. I'm talking to you from Sydney, Australia. Here we had bushfires. We also had floods, which impacted on our supply chains. This impacted on energy prices. We also had airports closed, and so were ports, which disrupted the flow of goods through countries, through supply chains. And of course, that led to inflation. And that's something that we're all suffering from now, and that's raising the cost of goods through the supply chain and creating a dilemma on how we pass that costs, or if we don't pass them on to the consumer. So on the demand side, and I had a very interesting chat with Gunther before we had this event, and she pointed out some really interesting aspects of the demand side of the supply chain, which are really impacting on forecasting and the flow of goods through the supply chain. Of course, through the lockdown, people focused on essentials. It was absurd, really, in Australia, but there was a run on toilet paper from everywhere. You couldn't buy toilet paper in any of the supermarkets, and people were actually charged with assault for trying to get toilet paper from people. Then there were the lockdown indulgences. People binged on chocolate. But as Gunther told me, they were binging on large blocks of chocolate and buying the big packs rather than buying the smaller packs that they had previously, and that created problems through the supply chain and inventories as well. Of course, at that time, it also drove online shopping, e-commerce and delivery, which placed pressure on logistics. It placed pressure on delivery, and particularly at a time when a lot of the delivery drivers were out there sort of struggling with the potential of catching COVID. So what were the impacts of that? We have the just-in-time model challenged. Certainly over the last few years, you'd all been aware that this has been almost the nirvana for supply chain, getting the goods there just in time to minimise cost. Well, certainly that model was significantly challenged during the pandemic and over the disruptions of the last few years. This led to a questioning of the other great economic force that we've been dealing with in supply chains, and that's globalization. Does it make any sense anymore to transport your raw goods to China to have them manufactured there, given the risks that are involved in that? So then this placed pressure on logistics, inventory and warehousing. As we've mentioned, inventory was once considered a bad word. People were not supposed to have inventory. Now, inventory has often been a blessing. All this has led to the demand for data and more data to drive forecasting models, and the data is coming from a wider pool of sources, not just immediate circles of suppliers, but much wider than that, as people try to get a much more accurate picture of their supply chain so that they can plan accordingly. And that's led into some of the areas that we're going to be talking about today: transparency and collaboration, for which data tools are undoubtedly the most important. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Gunther now. Gunther is a partner in supply chain transformation at IBM Consulting. Gunther Chelvanathan, welcome.
Hi, Lachlan. Hi, hello everyone. Good afternoon. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I think we're really talking about a very interesting topic. As you said, Lachlan, supply chain has become a big topic of interest. And previously, I think not many people knew what we did in our jobs, but now it's sort of like a topic at the dinner table. So definitely a time for us to really make an impact on businesses and how we work. So I think the topic for today is building resiliency and agility to make a more sustainable supply chain for the future of work. And I call it future of work because I don't think there's actually going back. It's really starting something that's going to be sustained. That's why we call it sustainable for the next few years. So if you go to the next slide, let me just talk a little bit. And I really want to make it very practical in the sense of what my clients are telling me. As I said, there's been a lot of interest in supply chain resiliency in the last 2 or 3 years, even starting a little bit before with the trade wars that were happening globally. Starting from that, I think there's been an exponential increase in how to build resiliency in the supply chain. And I just want to talk a little bit, and Lachlan, I know you mentioned a couple of these points, but what's really important is to, and I'll come to this later because I want to talk about a practical way of building resiliency in your supply chain, is to understand where is the biggest impact, and therefore you can have very planned and pointed solutions to deal with that. So that's why I think it's very important to understand where is the disruption, where is the biggest impact for your own supply chain, and no two companies are the same, right? They have a different footprint, they have different capabilities. Even if their products are the same, they may have a different consumer, distribution. So it's really very unique to each organization. We talked about demand and volatility in demand. So again, all the disruptions, not only COVID, but since then, we've had a lot of disruptions that's impacting on demand, product portfolio, what you really want to sell. So the whole S&OP process then, and also channels, the online channel versus the store type of setup, and even distributors, right? So when I talk channels, I'm really talking the extended channel strategy, and not being able to predict what the demand could be. So that was a real big challenge. Now, what that really impacts is, of course, the sales and operations process, that S&OP process, the demand forecasting process, and the planning process. So all of these are impacted by the volatility. And a lot of organizations and a lot of my clients were using historical information to forecast their demand, and historical sales, actual sales, to have a higher forecast accuracy, and that really didn't work. Limited visibility, I think that was the biggest choice that all of our participants today said they had an issue with, limited visibility across the end-to-end. So whilst there is, maybe parts of visibility or pointed solutions to look at certain parts of the supply chain, the end-to-end visibility was definitely lacking. Then supply chain costs has been a big issue, as of course, when there's disruptions and there is changes to how you need to operate your supply chain, that more or less means an increased cost. And so higher costs, and it's a continuing trend, especially now with inflation and escalation of transportation costs. So higher supply chain costs is a big issue that my clients are dealing with. And then, different, more risk areas. So whilst previously risk management was focused on certain areas, I think there are more risk areas now to cater for in the supply chain, production facilities, countries, locations, and that's just to do with basic operations, basic supply chain operations, and then sustainability. So while sustainability, I wouldn't call it a challenge, I think it is definitely a demand, a consumer demand and a regulatory demand. That means that we need to take it quite seriously and incorporate it into our competitive edge. So I think of it as an opportunity to be successful in the marketplace. So this, of course, I've just talked about 5 key areas. These issues have different impacts across the supply chain, and how you would resolve for that would be very differentiated, right, for each of these. And that's why I think it's very important to understand where the impacts are, how big the magnitude of the impact is, and how you want to resolve them, right? That's the secret of building resilience. If we move to the next slide, I I won't spend too much time on this. I've already talked about it. We interviewed a lot of our clients. Biggest challenge is supply challenge, obviously, because and a lot of the challenges was not necessarily in the tier N-1 supplier, i.e. your suppliers, but more the suppliers and more like the tier N-4 or tier N-5 supplier group, which you really have very little visibility on. Demand, we talked about. Supplier responsiveness and communications was a big issue for a lot of my clients. That means collaboration and communication techniques, right? And these were all very specific methods that we used in the past, and we really had to transition and move into new ways of collaboration. Logistics was always a challenge. We had the Suez Canal issue, and now the port disruptions, and continuing disruptions now across the end-to-end container shortage. We talked about, 50% more, 50 to 100% increase in logistics costs in some cases. And then there's a distribution challenge as well with distribution center interruptions. So these are what my clients are saying. So quite a lot of challenges across the end-to-end. Now, if you move to the next slide, I think we can talk a little bit. I won't spend a lot of time, but this is why the topic is resiliency today, right? We've got a long way to go. And when we talk to our clients, very few are really prepared at the moment to deal with disruptions. And it's more of a firefighting situation rather than building a sustainable solution for the future. And as you can see the numbers on the screen, not having enough visibility on their suppliers. And then we also talked about governance. So if you do have a disruption, what do you do? Who has control? Who makes decisions? What is that governance model, right? And now that's very important as well. And then, of course, if you want to, modify how you work, how quickly can you do that? What's the response times? And a lot of companies take a little bit of time. And it's not immediate, right? And how do we address all of this is really the question for today. If we move to the next slide, some of the things, root causes, I would say, that we're finding for not being able to build resiliency is limited formal processes to identify risks. So we talked about risks across all that, the end-to-end. There's, how do we capture those risks and how do we work on them, manage them? I think that was limited. Real-time visibility, big gap in a lot of organizations. The other thing was not having the ability to incorporate disruptions from the external economy or the environment into their demand and supply. So whilst they knew that something was happening, how do you work that into your operations? I think that was a big area where we saw there was no resiliency. Again, identified the risk. So there is a risk, but not being able to see what the impact is, like from a dollar amount, like quantitatively, how's that going to impact my revenue? How's that going to impact my production volumes, etc. I think that translation of that risk into concrete impact from a revenue and cost point of view, I think that was also lacking. And then mitigation activities, right? So whilst we were doing a lot of the organization to do firefighting activities, it's really putting into place mitigation activities across all of those disruption areas. I think that was where we saw some issues with building resiliency. So now we know a lot of the root causes. It's like, what do we do to fix them, right? How can we address this better? I think that's the question we want to answer today. So the way we typically, work towards building a resilient supply chain is through a 5-step process. And I just wanted to share some of this with you. So it's sort of like a structured way of assessing and building a resiliency in the supply chain. So the first step is about, really assessing the resiliency score. as I was saying, I talked about the 5 root causes previously, but going to the next level of detail and understanding exactly where the single point of failures are, or where you might be exposed to more risk, and building a strategy around it, right? So that's really the first step, really assessing the end-to-end and understanding all the points of weaknesses. The second point is to build a capability. So when I say capability, it could be from a process perspective, incorporating disruptions. How does the process change? It could be from a people perspective, training, upskilling them, training them up to be able to, work in that new world we talked about. And it can be in technology. And in some cases, it's all three, a combination of all three. So building that capability is important. The third part is the intelligence and the monitoring, the visibility, having that continuous, no longer, historical, but more current, real time, as well as predictive. So not only real time, but future looking. How can we incorporate some of the signals that we're seeing and try to predict what might happen down the road to the demand, to supply, and be able to respond in advance, right? So that's really the key. It's no longer about responding to historical disruptions. It's about how do we prepare for the future. So that's the third step is really important. The fourth step is having those operating procedures. What do we do in this case if this happens, and having those mitigation activities pre-planned, the team all understanding what needs to be done and trained up on those procedures. And then the fifth step is the crisis management. If something really, gets disrupted, what is the quick response crisis mode management activities that we need to do. So that's really the 5-step process. And if we go through this, I think in a structured manner, you're able to build resiliency into the supply chain. And it's not easy, obviously. It's not something that can be done overnight. A lot of my clients have been on this journey for the last 6 months to 1 year, and it is 2-3 year journey to build resiliency in the supply chain. So in the short term, you can work on the things that are really critical, and then in the longer term, build out that capability that I was talking about. If we move to the next slide, I just want to give a couple of examples of what can be that assessment and that strategy. Again, I talked about an end-to-end assessment, looking at the key products that drive the majority of revenue and focusing on them, looking at which risks will impact those products, those key critical products. What are the suppliers? Where are the production sites? Who's involved from internal operations? Which logistics players and ports, etc. So all of those things related to your key products, and then identifying mitigation strategies for each risk identified, right? So that's one of the things. And we talk a little bit, I often talk about wargaming. It's like putting up scenarios of, hey, if this happened, what happens to my supply chain? If this happens, what happens to my, and so really playing out those scenarios and looking to see that all your mitigation actions are ready to be deployed. So that's the first step, just giving you a few insights here. If we go to the next step of the process, next slide, the capability build out. Having the visibility and monitoring capability, and that could be technology. Some of us, we refer to it as a digital twin. So basically having a virtual replica of your supply chain that you can play around with and change scenarios and see that impact in a very automated and digital way. Control tower, I talk a lot about control towers. Again, this is about enhancing not only visibility, but having that predictive capability that I talked about, and also assessing early warning signals, right? Early warning signals, so we have a lot of time to respond. The other capability build outs, which is very more practical, is having alternative bombs, right, for your products or your services. What's the next best supplier? Do I have agreements with them, etc.? That kind of thing. We're seeing a lot of supplier impact at the moment, tier N-2, N-3, across nearly all my clients. That's the number one thing that they're seeing as a disruption at the moment, not being able to source the same products or even alternative products from the suppliers they've been working with for with for ages, for years. And then network flexibility. Lachlan mentioned globalization. There's been a lot of different strategies on how do we make some things more local and some things more, building diversity into the network and building flexibility that way. So so I've got this picture on the side. I wanted to just, sort of refer to it that whilst, the end-to-end supply chain for me really is everything, right from, all your logistics players, your manufacturing sites, to distribution centers, even to your customer, to the end customer, and then really having that layer of visibility and using a lot of exponential technologies that we call the AI powered technologies, advanced analytics, to drive a lot of this capability and insight, because it cannot be done manually. And unless it's automated, you really cannot see what is going to impact your organization. Now, if you move to the next slide very quickly, I think this is sorry, we'll just stop on this one. So, there's really two key ways, and this is, I'm just showing a more visual way. This is like backed by technology. There's really two ways we can approach it. One is the reactive, when something happens, how do we quickly detect, analyze, and confirm? So a lot of the collaboration with your suppliers. So it's very much event-based. So building that capability in, but also at the bottom, as you can see, more proactive workflow where we have predictive events, mapping out where your key risks are, analyzing it, and then prioritizing which ones you're going to be building mitigation strategies for. So we're moving into a predictive sort of model, protecting and acting before anything happens, and that's really building agility into your network. So if you go to the next slide. I think that was I won't talk to this one, just in the interest of time. Let's go to the next slide. So I think the last thing I really want to talk about is a little bit on building those advanced analytics. It's really moving up the maturity curve. I mentioned Watson here because, of course, IBM used Watson for a lot of our cognitive work. It's really moving, and whilst I talked about predictive supply chains, being able to predict events, but really when we talk about end-to-end supply chain, we really want to move into the cognitive realm, where our actions, how we respond, is recorded and then used for future events. So it's sort of embedded within the knowledge framework of the organization automatically, and then used for future disruptions or changes in either consumer demand or our internal capabilities as well. So it's really important to incorporate that into the end-to-end supply chain and the new ways of working as the way of building resiliency into our supply chain. So on the last slide, I think I have one more slide. I just want to say in closing, I think we have a fantastic opportunity as supply chain professionals to take control and really invest to build out a more resilient supply chain. And it's the time cannot be better than now. I was wondering whether there's any questions from the audience. If there isn't, yeah.
Yeah. So, what tools tools are there available to proactively build that to capture the action taken now for future? So, what tools are there available which we can use to make it automated?
So that's a good question. I think we have across all the different supply chain elements, and I can open it up to our panel as well later. Across the different, like for example, planning, or in manufacturing, or in logistics, we have multiple types of tools, planning tools, very advanced planning tools, transport management systems, TMSs, etc. And then, when we talk about control towers, Shok is here. He can talk a little bit about, O9 has got a control tower that can build in some of that AI, learnings into, prediction models, etc. IBM build we have our own product, the Supply Chain Intelligence Suite, but you also can do custom build. This is something that every company, every organization can leverage some of the automation and exponential technology capabilities that are now much more accessible to build their own custom tools. So there's a multitude of technologies and solutions there. So let me invite three of my colleagues onto the stage. Rajesh, who's the Digital Supply Chain Director for Asia Pacific and Japan from SAP. Shaw, who's the Vice President and Industry Solutions Leader for Southeast Asia and ANZ for O9 Solutions. And Amit, who is the Regional Sales Vice President for Asia Pacific for Zycus. Now, of course, very differentiated solutions and technology options. And I wanted to make it quite diverse because I think it is about a lot of different possible solutions coming together to resolve the end-to-end supply chain challenge of today. So let me just open it up to the panel. Like I've talked, Lachlan talked about a lot of disruptions that's happening. I talked a lot about how it's impacting my clients. If you can just tell me, maybe I start with Rajesh, if you can tell me what are the some specific challenges your clients are facing and what they're trying to resolve right now.
Thanks, good. I hope you're able to hear me.
Yes, I can.
Cool. So I think COVID, thanks to COVID in a way, because it brought back supply chain into the C-level table discussions again. So that's the positive thing I see in it. We have seen really a large set of differential challenges across industry to industry. For example, if you see pharmaceutical industry, they were not on top of vaccine, they had a huge responsibility of, making sure all the generic medicines available on time to make sure, give the capacity back to the hospitals to focus on COVID treatments, as an example, if I say. Or if I take an automobile industry, the demand was falling down. So they have to really recalibrate themselves to see how they can, reduce their, capacity, at the same time focus on which products are really driving their revenue, which means they have to recalibrate. Or if I take a food company, we work with one of the largest food customer in Asia Pacific and Japan, who have 70 production sites and close to some 7,000 SKUs. And their challenge was, I have large number of products, I have extreme capacity to manufacture and supply, but I don't know which product I want to focus upon, where I can dedicate my capacity on. So if I have to just summarize it at a highest level, the challenges were different from companies to company, where the demand was soaring extremely well, but they were not able to really get that, where they should focus. Whereas some companies, they wanted to recalibrate and refocus on where they can get some revenue maximization in place. So we are fortunate, honestly, to be part of their journey during their tough situations to help them out in specific challenges to each and every industry. That's how I would put it properly.
Yeah, that's great, Rajesh. I think that gave us some really good examples of how different industries had different challenges. Maybe Shok, if you can also add to that from your client pool.
Thank you, everybody. So just to agree with what Rajesh said there, we are seeing sort of two main themes in terms of challenges that we're supporting our clients with. Firstly, more in the supply and industrial manufacturing sector. Exactly as described earlier, we see supply not being able to keep up with demand. So we're helping clients with allocation of the very challenging supply that's not really dealing with an overall allocation framework, supporting clients with the overall prioritization and orchestration of the networks as well. And then, of course, using that digital twin concept that quite a few speakers touched upon today to really align the overall supply chain to that, look at the margin, revenue, on-time and full service level implications, and then really to drive that through to an IBP scenario where, management can make an informed decision. But that overall allocation of constrained supply to demand is sort of challenge number one. I think secondly, more in the CPG space, and this depends upon where clients are from a maturity journey perspective. A lot of clients are now focusing on IBP. So dependent upon where they are, it's really just creating a digital IBP platform, being able to do a few basic scenarios, get things together across multiple systems so they can make informed decisions. And the ones that are further down the maturity journey are really looking at gap closure analysis and in essence, looking at how to close the gap from a longer term forecast perspective to a medium term perspective and figuring out, okay, if I run this trade promotion at that price, at this timing for that duration, this is the implication. And of course, running that through the digital supply chain twin as well to come up with the overall view. So those are the sort of two main challenges we're seeing, Kunta.
Yeah, no, that's great, Shock. And I think that that totally resonates, as Rajesh and yourself both mentioned. Allocation is a big issue. Like I have this, where do I allocate my very scarce resources? And really understanding that, you know, these are the products that I should be focusing on, either from a demand perspective, as Rajesh, you were saying, you know, some certain products had way more demand in the pharmaceuticals sector, for example. And then really seeing the orchestration of that across the end-to-end supply chain. I think that's and to do that in an efficient manner, I think that was a big ask. But you know, we're all talking about you know, constrained supply. So I think this is a good time to ask Amit, because you know, he deals a lot with suppliers in his organization. Amit, over to you.
Yes, we are seeing some very interesting challenges across industries. I think some Rajesh highlighted, some have come from Shock as well. But I think last couple of years across, you know, specialty chemicals, oil and gas, healthcare, retail, we've seen some very, very interesting challenges. I'll share a couple of them. This was one of the largest pulp paper company over here in Southeast Asia, and they were having a huge churn in their procurement and supply chain teams. And the key reason for churn as it came out was that there was a lot of pressure from the owners to you know, de-risk the supply chain, drive savings and all of that. But their key challenge was that they were not able to get insight into their data, which was lying in different ERP systems, almost 8 of them. And that was actually putting pressure on those people. And at the same time, while the company is trying to de-risk the supply chain, drive savings, the people on the ground are actually leaving because they can't handle the pressure of not getting that visibility and be able to drive the actions that they need to take. So that's something that we helped them a couple of years back using the AI capability to be able to give them that visibility and hence be able to take those actions that they wanted to take. We actually collaboratively have worked with IBM on that, with SAP on that, and that has actually helped them. And today it's a fairly stable team over there. So these are the kind of examples we see. Another one I can think of is a specialty chemical company. And as you know, the chemical companies are undergoing a huge change because there is a lot of innovation happening. It is moving from B2B to even B2C because there are a lot of products coming in. Fashion industry needs chemicals and all of that. And hence it's not just about fulfilling the demand for them, but actually innovating at the same time. And also they are under a lot of pressure from a compliance perspective. You know, environmental demands are changing as well. So the same team, which is not skilled enough to be able to handle all this pressure and are more used to just simple fulfillment, how do you actually equip them with technology to, you know, help with all these pressures? So again, we are helping them through our AI technology around supplier risk, you know, identifying those risks in real time, which are environmental, legal, compliance, and so on and so forth. So these are some of them, some of the kind of examples that I can think of, which have helped customers in the last couple of years.
Yeah, thanks, Amit. I really like that, you know, how you brought it with the people angle, right? I think that a lot of the supply chain professionals have been under a lot of stress in the last few years. And of course, not being able to have the right technology means that they are not as efficient, or they can't really do, you know, the optimal level of you know, work to resolve the issues. So yeah, it definitely puts a lot of stress. And we are seeing a lot of you know, talent shortages in this space as we go forward. It's a very hot market for supply chain professionals. So it definitely is a great time to join the supply chain teams at this moment. But going back now, I just want to talk a little bit about tech, because we are technology companies at the end of the day, right? So where do you think, what kind of technology are your clients implementing? Maybe you could just to give our participants a little bit of a view as to what they can also think about for themselves.
I can go in first if that's okay.
Yeah, sure.
See, I think, when you say technology, it just reminds me a customer story, which was very interesting. I mean, in my experience of 20 years in supply chain, this was one, fundamentally, thought-provoking use case which I come across. So this customer in 2019, this was a consumer industry customer, and they started, they had a big management change in 2019. And the new management which sat in, they were just thinking, I'm spending too much time on the remaining 80% of the products, whereas my 80% of my revenue comes from the top 20%. And they knew it, but they didn't have any information to prove that. So when we spoke to them, they were in a situation of taking a big transformation, wherein they say, we will shelve the 70% of the products which are not really, driving me good revenue. That was a daring decision. If I'm in that CEO position, I have to really give it multiple thoughts, because there's a new guy sitting over there. And we were in the situation to make them a recommendation how this can be achieved and how this can be, transformed with the help of a technology, because the team is new and they want to put a new technology in place as when they're doing this business transformation in parallel. And the interesting point was this, this management said, when I'm doing this transformation, I want to take the technology's influence into consideration to define how this transformation will look like after the transformation. And, so which means that is where the technology played a role to tell them, to at least give them a baseline in understanding what could be those products that they have to invest their time in, and what could be the products they can, slowly, phase it off. And also gave them a perspective that, how they should be defining their processes in place so that they can grow. They will not stop at the 20%. Of course, they will grow, but grow in a right direction by considering the customer's choices and buying patterns, etc. After 3 years now, I think COVID also helped their transformation acceleration. They hit a tonk in 2020 on top of COVID, from the revenue perspective. But now, after 3 years, when they've set the map, they've exceeded the revenue of 2019 now. So I would say, and supply chain was the fundamental driver for that company, because, all the team came along, sales, marketing, finance came all along together. But, sales and operations were really major contributor to make this happen, because it was supply constraint. They had a huge supply constraint. At the same time, the sales was really quite demanding, and they have to really make these two people talk to each other to come in terms so that they can run the business in a sustainable manner for the next 3 years. So yeah, that was a short story that really, made me realize that, you got to take some challenging decisions, if you want to transform a company. And now they are, much agile, because they focus on lesser number of products. And they also now in a situation to grow in a much phased and a controlled manner, so that they can understand where they can invest their money when it comes to the new products they're rolling it out to the market. And this was probably an eye-awakening story for me from my experience that really added a lot of value when I shared with my C-levels that, guys, we have to sit, and technology is not just technology. Technology needs that infusion with the business. It has to really drive a huge value to our customers. Sorry for that long answer, but I think it was necessary.
Yeah, thanks, Rajesh. You talked about technology. Was there any specific SAP solutions that you implemented for this client?
Yeah, I mean, see, the management said that, I want to bring finance, sales, marketing, all these teams together. I want them to collaborate and then to do it. And you've been talking about sales and operations planning as a business process from the start. So we have implemented a solution called integrated business planning from SAP, and they just scratching the surface of it. With 2-3 modules, especially focusing on demand forecasting, sales and operations planning, and base supply planning.
Okay, right. Yeah. So as you said, so they're very specific solutions to help with this, right? And you can go as deep as you want, or and you can start and build on it as you go. So talking about planning, I think maybe Shock, you had a lot of probably have similar sort of stories to tell about solutions that your clients are looking out for. Is there anything specific that comes to mind that you can showcase?
Control towers and the capabilities of it. But maybe before I go to control towers, let me just contextualize from our perspective what we think a digital twin is. And that digital twin is really the driving engine for a control tower. Now, to us, a digital twin really encompasses three big components. Firstly, a market knowledge component, which is really what are your customers doing? What are your clients doing? What external sources of data can you use, for example, for demand forecasting? Whether it's Google mobility data or weather data or CPI indexes or whatever it might be. But in essence, a view of the external environment and really helping to understand what's going out there in the market. The second component of a digital twin to us is really a demand knowledge model. So this is your own internal forecasts, your new product introduction plans, your trade promotion plans, incentives, and so forth. And then the third component is really a digital twin of your physical supply chain, your trade lanes, your manufacturing flows, your bill of materials, your alternate bombs, as you called out earlier, Kunta. All of this combined and connecting these three modes together, that collectively forms a digital twin. Now, from a control tower perspective, for us, a control tower is really not just around the visibility. The visibility is a sensing piece. So in essence, what's going on out there, what purchase orders are delayed, what transportation orders are delayed, where are we seeing higher forecasts than expected, as an example. Then translating that using the digital twin concept to figure out, okay, this order is stuck here, the capacity is not sufficient to deliver in this particular factory. And then subsequently being able to run prescriptive scenarios for planners to figure out, okay, here are my options. This is what I can do. It actually makes sense from a gross margin perspective to respond to this capability. Then, of course, once you have that decision that makes sense from all of the typical KPIs, to push that through to execution. And I think the last point to call out is that learning capability from an AI ML perspective, feeding the root cause back, figuring out what it was. Do we need to tweak our forecasting algorithms? Is it the case of the lead times being wrong in the system, etc.? So combining the digital twin with a control tower capability to do that rapid response in the short-term horizon, to me, that agility piece really boosts up the resilience of supply chains.
Okay, great. That was a really good explanation of the control tower. I think I was going to mention it earlier. It's very hard. I mean, there's millions of data, both external and internal, to the organization to actually make sense of it and see what impact that is. It's actually a challenge in itself. So really bringing that external and even unstructured data, like what's happening with consumer sentiment, for example, and incorporating that into your supply chain planning and forecasting, I think makes a real big difference, right? Especially nowadays. So that's great that you brought it up. And we're really seeing a lot. I can see the number one question that I get from my clients is really about how to build that control tower in the way that you described it, right? So definitely a big area of interest. Amit, we were talking about risk in the supply chain as well, and I think a lot of companies are looking at how do we, that collaboration element, supplier collaboration, monitoring risk, etc. So maybe you can talk about certain solutions that your clients are.
So I spoke about two earlier, which was technology around giving visibility and then identifying risk for two different industries. I'll speak about one more. This is one of the largest retail chains over here in Asia, which when we started work with them had about 20,000 suppliers they are dealing with across 800 stores, and these stores are running in various malls. So there are like supermarkets, they have the standard shop, they have the specialty shops, they have the small mom and pop stores and all of that. And imagine these 800 stores dealing with these 25,000 suppliers on a one-on-one basis. So it's almost like a spider web, everybody's dealing with everyone. And that actually was leading to the inability to scale. And as everybody on the call probably knows, that retail is a very, very margin sensitive. It's a lot of transactions, but very low margin. And when these number of transactions go up, you actually reach a point where you say, look, we've grown so far, but beyond this, for us to be able to scale is almost impossible. So during their evaluation process, we actually met their board, and they spoke about this problem, and eventually they went for the supplier collaboration technology, where there is a common solution sitting in the middle, dealing with both stores and suppliers at the same time. And since then, the number of stores have actually tripled in the last 2 years' time, even in spite of the pandemic, because the technology actually enabled them to be able to scale that far. Again, we're working closely with SAP over there, even with Oracle, over there. But the technology is essentially the supplier collaboration technology, which helped them to actually scale up.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. I think collaboration, technology is key at the moment. The more you can communicate with your ecosystem partners. I would say ecosystem because it's really suppliers and your internal, your organizations, and your third party, or other third party organizations you might be working with, your customers as well, in some cases, distribution outlets, etc. I think that really collaboration layer is also very important going forward for the future of work. Now, one last, question. I think we talked about, even though we're not really talking about specifically sustainability, I think sustainability is also an area that we have the power to make a difference as supply chain professionals in the sustainability agenda. So maybe I can ask Shok first, and then we'll do it a different way this time. How is technology helping with that sustainability agenda? Because it's quite complex.
I think focusing on collecting data from a sustainability perspective and doing sort of retroactive reports in terms of where they are, what's happened, assuming, of course, people can agree on the different standards and so forth. So I think that's really the historical challenge. I think where technology needs to take us is really getting to a point where you can model the implications from a sustainability perspective. Let's assume through CO2 equivalents throughout the value chain. And then once that capability sits there, to bring that on board in terms of your S&OP and IBP cycles, in essence, to predict forward-looking what the implications from your decisions will be. So I think that's sort of where the technology will go. Looking at, of course, scope 1, 2, and 3, once you vertically connect your supply chain as well. But I think that forward-looking view is sort of the next revolution and where we need to focus on.
Yeah, okay, I really like that. So it's no longer about counting exactly what it is, what happened in the past, but more like what is it going to be in the future, and trying to make decisions that change that future. I like that. Amit, how about yourself? Sustainability.
Yeah, we are seeing that that we are somewhere in the sustainability journey, because the customers are very clear they want to move towards the net zero score, and they typically are engaging consulting companies to set up a framework. But that framework essentially is something that has to be driven and to be scaled up. So that's where we are coming into the picture in terms of providing technology, which is one step towards that journey. Obviously, it's not a holistic solution, but we are essentially providing AI solutions that can actually get information from across the sources across the world, like EcoVadis and DNB and other sources, which talk about capability of a supplier and how far are they contributing towards that net zero goal that the companies have. So that's essentially where we are helping companies towards. And also they are relooking at the current supply base, that are they the ones who are capable of scaling up towards that sustainability goal. So how are they performing today? So that's another area that we are helping them in terms of technology and helping them baseline where your current supply base stands.
Okay, yeah, no, that's really, it's hard to find information, especially if you have 20,000 suppliers, right? How do we collate all that information about the current state? So definitely need some technology, and if we can facilitate that, that's great. And yourself, Rajesh, where are you seeing that?
I mean, when it comes to sustainability, there is always a quote I remember, which once a CEO told me, one of our customer CEO, and this is just a place which we have borrowed it from our future children. And that puts us in a seat of highest responsibility of making this place better for our future generations. And I'm glad that, my company, SAP, puts sustainability in their hearts. And when I say they put it in their hearts, they're infusing sustainability in each and every product we are developing. When it comes to sustainability, sustainable supply chain forms the fundamental of it, because when you procure a material, the supplier has to get his raw material. Or let's say when I'm manufacturing, I have to move this raw material from my supplier to my manufacturing location. Wherever this goods is moving, until the consumer, consumes it, even after consumer consumes it, it comes back, there is a reverse supply chain going on. There's a huge footprint we have to address. So how we are trying to address that is, we have many, almost, 1.5 lakh customers are using our ERP solutions, including our Fortune 500 companies. All this procurement module, manufacturing module, and production planning, the quality management module and logistics module, all these 4 operations modules, not only operations module, any product, we measure the carbon emissions based upon the unit cost attached to that particular activity which is being performed. Which means as an organization, that's the first baby step I should take where I'm really emitting more. Then that gives an opportunity for C-levels to take decisions. Should I really focus on my operations and manufacturing, or should I really talk to my suppliers? If I have to throw another example beyond ERP, we have millions of suppliers in our business network platform called Ariba. And whenever I throw a purchase request to my suppliers, in the past history, it was always the speed at which the supplier can give back the material, or the preference was always the price or the speed. But now there is a sustainability index provided by each and every supplier is being rated that, this is what the carbon emission per unit they will do. That makes you a sustainable company by working with the sustainable suppliers. So we see the value is huge, and we have put it in our hearts, and that's I can talk hours together on the topic, but in the interest of time, yes, we are quite, that's the need of the hour, and that's where this new term called green line is becoming really more and more important. In every discussions with the C-level, forget about top level and bottom level. If I get my green level correct, then the companies will invest on me. That's the pressure under which the C-level is operating upon. So with that, I will leave it to you. That's becoming a huge topic. And Kunta, in the interest of time, I'll just give it back to you.
Yeah, thanks, Rajesh. No, I think that's a good note to end on. I think you put it right. It is the need of the hour, as we say, and where to focus your energies. I think that's the visibility of that is very important. And as Amit said, hundreds, thousands of suppliers. How do we rank them? How do we rate them? That's really important, visibility on that. And then coming back to shock, it's not only about current, it's about what is happening in your supply chain in the future, and being able to make decisions today that impact that, and having visibility over what it would be. I think that's key. So I think we have a really nice holistic solution. If we add all of them together, we'll have the perfect solution. So thank you very much. I know we're a little bit over time, but I think it was a good note to end on. So thank you to all of you for being on the panel today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kunta.
Over back to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, panel, and thank you, Kunta. Now we're to talk about getting started with future steps. Now, Kunta, can I ask you? You talked about the resiliency score. Could we start by talking about that? Is there a methodology that you would advise for organizations in understanding this resiliency score, which you put at the very beginning of the process?
Yeah, so exactly. So I think, when we're doing that assessment and building out your strategy, we are a whole heap of sort of questions, checklist sort of questions for each part of your supply chain, whether it be planning, manufacturing, logistics, distribution, etc., whatever it is. And then as you go through that, you can see how mature you are on that. And as you get your score, you can understand your maturity level, and you can break it down into the different areas or have a holistic score as well. So that does give you a little bit of a more guide light to see whether you can improve on the resiliency. Yeah.
You talked a lot about ecosystems and expanding ecosystems. When you get to that point, do you have to have an understanding of the expanded ecosystem to understand your resiliency?
Yeah, a little yes and no. So no, from the perspective that you do want to assess your supply chain first, but in the manner that whether you can incorporate external data into your into your supply chain very effectively. Now, you don't necessarily need to have all that data accessible from day one, but whether you can incorporate that data. You can buy the data very quickly, easily, but if it means nothing if you cannot see the impact to your supply chain, and that's what we're measuring for.
I mean, it seems that we did talk about the disruptions and how, for some industries, the just-on-time model has been challenged. I mean, it would seem that over the last few years, supply chain practice has been driven by the need to drive down costs, and that's completely understandable, and that's driven globalization. Now that it's been challenged, would you say that resilience is the priority, and that organizations are now prepared to sacrifice a bit of cost in their supply chain for resiliency?
Yes, I think so. I think it is a balancing act. If you don't build resilience, you might not even be in business,
Yeah.
right? So you won't have product on the shelf to sell. So it is really about making those compromises, I would say, on also maybe lower margins for organizations. So it is about sacrificing a bit of cost, a bit of margin to be able to serve your customers, your end consumers. Yeah.
Yep, and it would seem that in all this, in transforming supply chains, the innovative access to as-a-service providers would be very key. I'd just be interested in your comments on how organizations' engagement with service providers has changed as a result of the changes they need to make to get their supply chains more resilient.
Okay, so service providers like consulting companies and software organizers, is that what you mean?
Yes.
Yeah, no, I think there's been an incredible, interest in getting service providers to help. There are lots of areas, as we said, we're moving into exponential technologies. There is assessment technology, as you also mentioned, the scorecard, etc., that you want to have a third party have a look at and give you a more sort of balanced view, a neutral view, right? Rather than from internal to the organization. So service providers have been, I think, the linchpin to make some of these transformations happen. And a lot of organizations, don't have, first of all, they don't have the structure or the capability to hire a lot of these talents that you need in the technology space. In some of the transformation area spaces. So I think depending on, or not, I wouldn't say depending, but reaching out to service providers to fill those gaps, I think is the best way forward.
Now, we heard a lot in the panel about the creation of digital twins. What would you say to an organization that was hadn't done that yet, but obviously needed to do it? What are the first steps in creating a digital twin?
The first steps. Wow, that's a hard one. I think the way we would do it, it's a big topic, right? And you can spend years trying to make a virtual
We've got about 2 minutes.
image of your digital twin. But I think it's going back to what is really critical. As I said, what are the products that are really impacting your bottom line, and looking at those products and really getting to understand those from a digital perspective, from all the data surrounding those products, the risks, the disruptions, etc. So the use cases. So I want to be able to do this X, Y, Z, that use case, and then seeing how I can replicate that use case in technology. I think that's the first step to building a digital twin.
Excellent. Well, Kuntha, thank you so much for your time. Thank you to all our participants, all our speakers, our panelists, our participants and attendees. I think it's been a fascinating hour and a half. And now it's for me to throw to you for some concluding remarks.
Yeah, thanks, Lachlan. I think it's been a fantastic session, very fast paced. I think we covered a lot of topic, a lot of areas, and it's a vast topic. But I think I'll go back to my closing remarks, right? I think that as supply chain professionals, we have an incredible role to play in how the future looks, not only from a sustainable way of working. And when I say sustainable, the new ways of working, the predictive, the cognitive type of ways of working, rather than the traditional supply chains. Also, as we incorporate more social sort of requirements into our operations, the sustainability angle, I think now is the time to act.
So thank you, Kunta, and thank you, everyone. That's the end of our session. We will be making a recording of the session available to all the participants, and to those who haven't managed to attend today, they'll be able to receive it too. So this will live on for a while at least, and hopefully people can continue to get some value out of what has been a fascinating discussion. So thank you all.
Thank you.